So in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to bring on to stage Dr. Richard Silkman. He's a PhD economist, nationally recognized as an expert in regulation of public utilities, in the development of competitive energy markets, and the development and licensing and operation of power plants, including hydroelectric and generating stations. He's a co-managing partner of Competitive Energy Services, has served as an expert witness before a number of state and public utilities and regulatory commissions, as well as advised state legislators on electric utility regulation and deregulation. There's a lot of information just right there. In 1986, Dr. Silkman served as a chief policy advisor to the governor of Maine on economic policy, energy, hydropower, land use, natural resources policy. I'm personally curious to learn more about how he has been part of and developing a wind project, and also is a founding partner in Grid Solar, addressing grid reliability. I'm thinking we may need to ask him back for an hour next time. Now, to introduce you and to introduce us to our speaker, please welcome Dr. Rich Silkman. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I'm here only to introduce Bill. I'm not here to lecture on energy, although I would be happy to do it at some other time in the future. When Tom asked if I would introduce Bill for tonight's presentation, Bill Harwood, I immediately said yes. I've known Bill for 30 years, through some of the most turbulent times in the history of Maine's utility industry and energy policy. Often, though not always, on different sides of the same issue. Suffice it to say that there are few people in Maine who are as knowledgeable about the regulation of public utilities as Bill. He's a Harvard graduate, has a law degree from Fordham, 40-year career in the regulation of public utilities, representing public utilities, representing consumer groups, colleges, universities, energy companies, and consumers in front of regulatory bodies across the state, but most importantly, the Maine Public Utilities Commission and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. Bill has served on many organizations and boards, but I think it's fair to say he's most noted for his work in promoting access to legal services for Maine's poor and indigent people. He's a past recipient of the Muskie Access to Justice Award, the American Bar Association Pro Bono Publico Award, and the Howard Dana Award for Outstanding Services. And, as all of you know, Bill was nominated by Governor Mills and confirmed by the Senate to serve as Maine's public advocate, a position he's held now for 2.5 years, and we all hope he continues in that position for a lot longer. And it's a testament to Bill's integrity that a governor would nominate a career utility lawyer to represent Maine consumers in utility cases. And perhaps the best indication of Bill's reputation in Maine, that the legislature actually confirmed him, a utility lawyer to represent consumer interest. Bill has now become the Joni Mitchell of Maine's utility world, having looked at utilities from both sides now. But unlike Miss Mitchell, who only recalled life's illusions and confessed to not really knowing life at all, Bill's years of working for utilities has left him with no illusions, and he really does know utilities. He has brought that knowledge to the service of Maine consumers in his role as the public advocate. The role of the public advocate, that's the rub. Just what is the role of Maine's public advocate, and what will it become in the future? It can no longer be solely to ensure that rates charged by electric utilities are, to use the legal standard, just and reasonable. Not when we as a state and a world are looking to electrification of all energy use and decarbonizing the electric grid as the key solution to lowering CO2 and dealing with greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. As many of you know, electrification means using more electricity, much, much more. In Maine, on the order of 2 to 3 times what we currently use just to convert from fossil fuels to electricity in space heating, transportation, and industrial processes. Perhaps another 1 times what we currently use to support the demands of data centers and artificial intelligence and computational capability around the world. Decarbonizing the grid requires on the order of 10 times more solar than is currently online now in Maine. Plus, the full development of onshore wind resources in Aroostook County, plus hundreds of turbines in the Gulf of Maine, thousands when we consider that New Hampshire and Massachusetts are looking at that same resource to meet their decarbonization goals. And of course, lots and lots of storage. Battery storage to carry us through the times when it's not windy and the sun's not shining. And once everything's 100% electric, we're going to need a grid that's self-healing, where outage events are simply not tolerated. This is going to cost a lot of money. We all understand that. Much of this money has to be front-end loaded. We have to build out that grid to accommodate the usage that will ultimately follow. And that's going to mean increases in electric rates. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if during Bill's term as public advocate, we see the largest electric rate increases for delivery services in our history. It's also going to require the construction of major electric infrastructure, transmission lines to northern Maine, and ultimately transmission lines throughout the state. The development of Sears Island to enable the constructions of thousands of floating wind turbines, each one of which is larger than most of the skyscrapers in New York City. And the design of electric rates to make the incremental use of electricity less expensive, not more expensive, so we don't make electric cars and space heaters so expensive to operate that people don't convert. This is what the public needs. It's the path that's been laid out for us in state law. And it's what the role of the public advocate must expand to encompass. It won't be easy. We've had lawyers serving as public advocates for a long time, leaving the safe and familiar confines of just and reasonable to deal with encouraging and advancing transmission lines in the face of localized opposition, to advocate for harnessing the winds in the Gulf of Maine in the face of lobster and fishing interest opposition, to advocate for new rate structures that promote increasing use of electricity, rate structures that are contrary to positions long held by most public advocates in the country. But I share Governor Mills' confidence in Bill Harwood. He really is the right person for this job. He possesses the ideal balance of temperament, experience, intelligence, and integrity to advocate for the public. Oh, and lest I forget, perhaps his most important quality is he's not running for governor or any other political office, so that he's not afraid of being disliked. So with that, I present to you now Maine's Public Advocate, Bill Harwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich, for that kind introduction. You've just heard from Rich Silkman, so it's almost as if now we can go home. We've heard everything there is to know. Rich is an extraordinary person and made an extraordinary contribution to the state for all of his work in government, consulting with projects, and running his own business. We are very fortunate to have someone of Rich Silkman's background and expertise. When Tom Saliba called me after I said yes, I would be happy to show up tonight and share my thoughts, he called back a couple of days later and said, I've got an idea for you. How would you feel if Rich Silkman introduced you? And I paused for a minute and I said, I got a better idea, Tom. Why don't I introduce Rich Silkman? Tom said, sorry, you're it. So with that, here goes. First, a word about my work. As public advocate, I work with a group of 10 dedicated professionals who every day look out for Maine ratepayers. We advocate for ratepayers before state and federal regulatory agencies, such as the PUC, before judges in Maine courtrooms, and before committees of the Maine legislature. Much of that work involves making sure that utilities, such as CMP and Versant Power, fulfill their responsibilities as regulated utilities to provide good service at affordable prices. But tonight, I want to focus on the unregulated side of the electric business, the generation of electricity, sometimes referred to as the supply side. As we're all frequently reminded by CMP and Versant, since 2000, they have nothing to do with generating the electricity we consume. They simply deliver it to us over their poles and wires. Unfortunately, today, it's the unregulated supply side of the industry that's driving up our electricity bills to heights we have never seen before. Today, some ratepayers are paying the staggering price of 20 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour, when just a few years ago, we were all only paying 10 to 15 cents. How did this happen? Who's benefiting from these high prices? And who is watching out for the consumers who are forced to pay them? To understand this, it's helpful to go back to when CMP and Versant, then known as Bangor Hydroelectric Company, held a monopoly that included not just the poles and wires used to deliver the electricity, but also the generating facilities. Consumers paid a single price to the utility for both delivery and supply. At the time, the utilities adopted a critically important strategy of diversifying their generating sources. They maintained a balance of nuclear, oil, and hydroelectric. And that wasn't because they couldn't make up their mind. No, they understood well the cost of each type of generation, but they also understood that they could not fully control those costs. They understood that at any time, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission could impose costly new regulations on Maine Yankee or Seabrook or the Millstone nuclear facility. They understood that at any time, OPEC could limit oil production, driving up fuel prices for Yarmouth's oil-fired Wyman Station. And they understood that at any time, Mother Nature could limit the amount of snow and rainfall, thereby reducing water flow in Maine rivers and limiting the generation of electricity at hydro stations, such as the Wyman Dam on the Kennebec River. The utility strategy of not putting all their eggs in one basket provided a highly valued price stability for all Maine ratepayers. But things started to change in the late 70s. When President Jimmy Carter called the Arab oil embargo the moral equivalent of war, Congress passed something called PURPA, and the Maine legislature followed suit by passing its own version known as Mini PURPA. PURPA required CMP and Versant to purchase renewable energy, mostly from large industrial facilities. Two noteworthy points about PURPA. First, the legislature itself dictated the price that the utilities must pay for the energy from those PURPA facilities. The legislature did not give the regulatory agencies like the PUC and their professional staff discretion to set a price that would have fairly balanced the economic interests of the sellers and the purchasing utilities. Second, the utility was required to buy the power at a price based on avoiding the future cost of buying from some hypothetical alternative source of electricity. There was no regard for the seller's actual cost of generating the energy. A pretty novel way, when you think about it, of setting a purchase price. It's a bit like getting two bids for a job and hiring the low bidder, but then paying him or her the higher price bid of the losing bidder. That's the cost you would theoretically avoid by selecting the low bidder. There is simply no consideration of whether the seller could sell at a lower price and still make a reasonable profit. As you might imagine, after just a few years, the program was scrapped as too costly for ratepayers, but not before the utilities were forced into some very expensive long-term contracts to buy energy, mostly from large industrial facilities, including several of Maine's paper mills. Historians will no doubt debate how much of a role PURPA played in extending the life of several Maine paper mills and their high-paying jobs. But there should be no doubt that for the life of those long-term PURPA contracts, Maine ratepayers paid substantially higher rates than if PURPA had never become law. After PURPA, the next big development came in the 1990s, when reformers came up with the idea of restructuring the electric utility industry. Unlike PURPA, where ratepayers subsidize renewable energy by requiring utilities to buy the power at inflated prices, restructuring required utilities to exit the generation or supply side of the business altogether. Starting in 2000, CMP and Versant were excluded from owning or operating generation facilities in order to allow a free market of unregulated buyers and sellers of electricity to develop. While this market competition led to the retirement of some older, less efficient generating facilities, it had the unintended consequence of promoting natural gas-fired generation. Essentially, Wall Street investors saw generating electricity by burning natural gas as the lowest risk, highest return way into this newly created market. The result, today approximately 50% of our electricity is generated by burning natural gas. Regardless of what you might think about the environmental effects of burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, restructuring turned its back on the old utility strategy of having a diversified portfolio of generation. Remember CMP's nuclear, oil, and hydro mix. That was gone. As a result, today the price of natural gas on the international market dictates the price we pay for electricity here in Maine. And sure enough, when Putin invaded Ukraine and turned the international market for natural gas upside down, electricity prices in Maine went through the roof. Now, to address the environmental problems created by this growing dependence on burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, policymakers needed to put their thumb on the scale and give Wall Street a bigger incentive to invest in renewable energy, such as wind and solar, rather than continue investing in gas-fired generation. Beginning in the mid-2000s, CMP and Versant were sent back into the supply side of the business, but only to enter into long-term agreements to buy renewable energy from qualifying generators at prices favorable to those generators. After receiving the energy they purchased, the utilities simply turned around and resold the energy into the wholesale market, often at a substantial loss. Essentially, the policymakers relied on CMP and Versant's strong balance sheets and stable finances to set them up as creditworthy buyers of the energy in order to entice Wall Street to invest in Maine renewable energy. And to control the amount of the ratepayer subsidy that was included in the purchase price, the renewables were required to engage in a competitive bidding process managed by the PUC, and only those renewables with the lowest bids were rewarded with long-term contracts to sell their output to CMP or Versant. But the renewable energy industry wanted more, and so they went back to the legislature in 2019 and convinced legislators to enact a major expansion of something called net energy billing. Net energy billing, a program where, instead of competitive bidding, utilities were required to buy renewable energy from qualifying facilities, mostly solar, at the current retail price of electricity, not the prevailing wholesale price. If you think this sounds a bit like PURPA from the 1970s, you're not far off. Once again, the legislature, not the PUC, was dictating the price utilities must pay for energy that they didn't want or need. And once again, the price was set without regard to the seller's actual cost of building or operating the facility. The result? A spectacular success in terms of attracting investment in Maine's renewable energy, but a spectacular failure in terms of controlling electricity costs paid by Maine consumers. The concept of net energy billing, or NEB as it's referred to, has been around for many years. It was originally designed for small behind-the-meter generators, those whose primary purpose was serving the needs of the owner on whose property the generator was located. Think of a wind turbine on a rural farm or a rooftop solar panel. During times when the generator produced more electricity than the owner needed, the excess was sold to the local utility. The built-in subsidy was not a major concern because the generators were required to be small and the amount of excess energy sold to the utilities was even smaller. But, as I say, all that changed in 2019 when the solar industry convinced the legislature to greatly expand the net energy billing program. Specifically, the legislature made two major changes. First, qualifying projects could be as large as 5 megawatts. Most of us don't understand what that is, but it is large enough for the project's solar panels to cover 20 acres of land, not your small rooftop solar. Second, the project did not need to be located behind the meter on the property of the project owner. The project could be located anywhere. The end result was generators that looked a lot more like typical large utility-scale generators than small rooftop solar panels on a modest suburban home. Currently, there are thousands of qualifying projects either in operation or under development under Maine's NEB program. They collectively represent over 1,500 megawatts of generating capacity. That's more than the capacity of Maine Yankee, or Wyman 4, or the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant. That's a lot of energy. Under the program, the price the utilities are required to pay, approximately 20 cents a kilowatt hour today, is more than twice what it actually costs the developer to build and operate the solar project. And as more and more NEB projects are built and come online, the total ratepayer subsidies will continue to increase up to an estimated $220 million a year. And this subsidy will continue for 20 years, resulting in a total program subsidy of over $4 billion. Now, before I continue, I want to clarify my position on renewable energy. We need more renewable energy, and we should have less energy generated by burning oil or natural gas. Our office supports Maine's climate goals, and we will do all we can to help achieve those critically important goals. We simply can't continue indefinitely burning imported oil at facilities such as Wyman 4 on Cousins Island. Oh, how I dream of the day when that eyesore will be torn down. But we must be smart in how we subsidize the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. Unfortunately, the net energy billing program is neither a smart nor cost-effective way to do so. Next week, CMP's average residential rates will increase by another 12.5%, due in large part to the rising cost of the NEB program. On July 1st, NEB subsidies reflected in utility rates will exceed $130 million a year. Typical residential ratepayers will be paying over $100 just for NEB. Small commercial customers will be paying thousands of dollars per year just for NEB. And some large industrial customers will be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars per year just for NEB. Not surprisingly, this has led to ratepayers strongly objecting to these increases. Advocates for some of the more well-heeled large industrial customers argue that they didn't ask for this. They didn't cause the utilities to incur these NEB costs. It's hurting them competitively, and it's jeopardizing good-paying Maine jobs. As a result, they claim it is both unfair and bad public policy to charge them for NEB costs. This advocacy has led to a sort of food fight in front of the PUC between different ratepayer groups, each arguing that they should pay less of the NEB costs and somebody else, some other ratepayers, should be paying more. Understandably, no one wants to shoulder these large subsidies. Like PURPA in the 1970s, once again, the legislature has, with all the best of intentions, created a program to heavily subsidize renewable energy, and once again, ratepayers are pushing back. Enough of how we got here. What can be done to protect ratepayers, or what should be done? The good news is it's not hopeless. We can reform the current system to create a better balance between promoting renewable energy and controlling costs by following a few simple principles. First, the PUC, not the legislature, should set the amount of any subsidy. The PUC employs a staff of approximately 75 professionals led by 3 highly experienced full-time commissioners. They are much better equipped than our part-time legislature with limited staff to carefully balance the competing demands of more renewable energy on the one hand and affordable electricity prices on the other. Second, the subsidy should be based on the renewable developer's actual cost of building and operating the facility, rather than some theoretical price that attempts to reflect the societal benefits of renewable energy. After all, over-subsidizing renewable energy will not increase the amount of benefits we receive from each of the subsidized facility. Using competitive bidding to determine which projects receive a subsidy and how large a subsidy will control cost without jeopardizing our goal of expanding renewable energy. Those developers who need a subsidy will need to sharpen their pencil to bid the lowest price that will cover their costs, and the PUC will then reward the low bidders with a long-term contract with CMP or Versant. This will ensure that the subsidy paid to the winning bidders will be no more than is necessary to build and operate the project. In the end, I believe that Maine ratepayers want more renewable energy. They just don't want to overpay for it. But I can't win this fight alone. Each of you needs to speak up and let your elected representative know your views on this issue. It's too important to be left to a few well-heeled Augusta lobbyists to do all the influencing. Maine consumers who have to pay their CMP bills every month and also manage a tight budget, whether for their family or their business, are the most effective advocates for common sense energy policy. Your voice needs to be heard. Please join me in helping the legislature get this critical policy right. Thank you. Tom, I don't know whether we have time for a few questions, but I'm happy. I know there's a lot of expertise in the audience, and I'm happy to take some questions.
I would only ask that people ask the question and not give a speech, and that you show great respect.
So I'd like to know what's in it for the legislature to retain this influence and how to remove it from them to PUC as you're suggesting.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it involves a lot of politics, which many of you in the room are at least as good, if not far better than I am. A couple of pieces. I think in their heart of hearts, the legislature understands how difficult it is to make these decisions. They are heavily lobbied. They are only in session for a few months. They only have a few hours to spend on these critically important issues, and they have very limited staff support. I think the legislature would welcome giving to a regulatory agency like the PUC this difficult task, this difficult responsibility to balance. Now, it gets more complicated. Many of those legislators voted in 2019 to expand net energy billing. And let me say right off the bat, I don't criticize them. Had I been in the legislature, perhaps many of you, had you been in the legislature, we may well have voted for the thing in 2019. They didn't have all of the information about the consequences, and that's my point. So we do have this awkwardness where many of the legislators who voted for it are still there, and it is always hard. It's human nature. It is difficult to say, I think I made a mistake. I want to try and fix it. I want to do something different. That is hard, particularly for politicians who will always be criticized, and so the natural instinct of those who voted for it in 2019 is to defend it. I think what we're seeing is a growing outcry from consumers, particularly some of the larger industries up north, saying this is more than we can handle. This is going to hurt. This is going to cause us to lose good-paying Maine jobs. Time will tell how this plays out and whether this is yesterday's problem, it's time to move on, or whether this is a growing problem and we're in the early years of this $4 billion subsidy. Maybe we can figure out a way to adjust that subsidy to make it a little fairer for both the consumer and the developer. And let me say, I don't criticize the developers for coming in and taking advantage of this. That was the whole point of why this was enacted. They behaved rationally. They did what they are expected to do. They did what their investors want them to do. And so I don't think they're the villain here either. But I do think there is a growing body of evidence that this subsidy is more than most of them need. And that's the hard question.
A couple of weeks ago, you did a great presentation, and you agreed that it's not the renewable energy that's the cost problem, because actually solar and wind have free fuels, and they are the least expensive ways to generate energy in the United States now. It's the mechanism of delivery through to customers, right? So I have a two-part question. One is, How do we accelerate interconnection to that less expensive renewable energy so that we don't have market binding and inflation? And also, how do we maintain consumer choice, let's say a democracy or a democratic approach to the grid? Thank you.
Those are some tough questions. Let's leave the choice aside, put the choice aside for the minute. I think what you've put your hand on is another, I didn't mention this in my remarks, of another challenge that net energy billing has raised, and that's this whole interconnection uproar. And there are a lot of very hardworking, well-intentioned developers who are caught up in this interconnection problem, waiting in line to get their project ready to be connected to the grid. It is a real problem. The problem starts with the electricity grid wasn't designed to have this amount of generating capacity out at the end where the consumers are, where the businesses and residential are. So we are now trying to say to those engineers, you need to reverse engineer, and we need to be able to put this 1,500 megawatts, or maybe it'll turn out to only be 1,200 megawatts of net energy billing out in these remote areas, and let that electricity go the other way back into the central part of the grid, the built up, the major part of the grid. That's a tall order for these engineers. Can they do a better job? Could CMP have done a better job? Absolutely. But don't make any mistake. What we asked the utilities to do when they adopted the net energy billing in 2019 was a large task. Think of the water utility, where you have a pond or a river or an aquifer, and all the water goes in one direction, from there to the customer to the meter. That's the way the electricity grid was set up until recently. Now we want it to go both ways. That's no small task. The other part of that question, I believe, is location. In so many things in the business world, it's location, location, location. What happened with net energy billing, many of the developers sent their staff out into the state to find cheap land near a substation. If you can find cheap, undeveloped land near a substation, we're good. And what happened, of course, is all that cheap land near a substation got bought up by multiple different developers, and before we knew it, the substation couldn't handle all those developers. So my advice is, when we do the competitive bidding, competitively bid by location. We know in the Versant and CMP grid, certain areas can accommodate a lot more wind and solar. Some areas, it would be very expensive to reinvest the system so it's ready for more wind and solar. Let's bid where we can and give those developers the opportunity. That really is part of the problem with net energy billing. We didn't think where the growth would come. We just let it happen, and then we stepped back and said, oh my word, we've got way too many of these projects clustered in certain areas. With respect to the choice, this is a hard one. Obviously, we want choice in terms of our electric gadgets. We want choice in terms of how you heat your home, what car you drive as an electric vehicle. I'm not so sure choice in terms of who actually delivers the electricity or who generated the electricity that comes to your house or my house. I'm old school. Not everyone would agree with this. I believe the model of public utility regulation is that because of the economics of electricity, it works better when we have a single provider, a monopoly provider, who is heavily and strictly regulated by a government agency. So the choice gets complicated. Others?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
fine.
My name is Sue Inches. I'm right here from North Yarmouth. And my issue is really about the reliability and strength of the grid. So where I live in North Yarmouth, we have outages all the time. And so my concern is, how are we going to upgrade the grid to handle, the demand that we already have, let alone the additional demand of renewables coming online? So my question to you is, what is the strategy? What should we be looking to do? I know there's a lot of different variables in this equation, and I'm wondering, should we be trying to change federal incentives? Should we be trying to change ownership? Should we be trying to change investment strategy? What is your idea of what strategy we need to strengthen the grid that we have?
Great question. Thank you, Sue. The other reason why your rates are going up 12.5% on July 1st, the bigger reason is storm cost restoration. And that, I think, is what's getting at this. We are having more and more frequent, more and more severe storms. That is just a given from climate change. And it is creating havoc in terms of where the public utilities are, not just because of the frustration and inconvenience of losing our power for a day or two or three, but the cost of getting that power back on is exorbitant. It is exponentially above what it has been historically. What some of the things that are going on, the electric utilities tell us, is the old nor'easter. We all grew up with the winter nor'easter. That was the big storm. Well, after decades and decades of nor'easters, the trees had learned, the root systems had learned how to withstand a nor'easter, or at least those that didn't were long gone. Now, with climate change, it's not the nor'easter anymore, it's the sou'easter. The wind is coming from a whole different direction, and it is creating havoc with the trees and the root system, which weren't designed over decades and decades to withstand it. So we've got a real problem. In the old days, the utilities would typically be spending $20 million a year on storm restoration. Last year, $200 million. And if you just run a straight graph, that line is going up year after year. Before we know it, it'll be $250 million. The cost, when you're driving on the turnpike and you see all those trucks, usually 2 or 3 days after the storm, you'll see them all heading south, and you'll think, what is that going on? There's about 25 of those trucks all heading south. Those are the costs we pay through the nose to bring those arborists from all over, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, upstate New York, to come to Maine and essentially spread out into the field. We're paying them time and a half, double time. We're feeding them. We're putting up on hotels. And before you know it, even a modest storm is costing us tens of millions of dollars. So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, let's stop spending so much on those crews. Let's figure out how to get our own crews. But more importantly, let's change the way we harden the grid. Let's get the electric grid so it can withstand those storms. There has to be more cost-effective ways. What CMP might have been cost-effective for them 10 years ago is no longer enough. When the storm restoration costs were $10 or $20 million a year, you could only justify spending a certain amount. When it's $200 going on to $250 million a year, there's much more to be done. More tree trimming, get those branches away from those lines, make those poles stronger, get away from wooden poles, more steel poles. Start to think about putting some of this underground. If we go underground, which is expensive, but if we're spending $250 million a year to get the power back on, we can start putting more of this system underground where no matter how strong the wind blows from the southeast, those lines will continue to transmit electricity. And there are many more. Our office has hired a national expert to come in and make recommendations. The Public Utilities Commission is about to open a new investigation into this whole area. I am confident. I don't think we're going to save a ton of money, but my mantra is less money on storm restoration and more money on avoiding outages. You know, it can be a little bit romantic those first couple of hours when the lights go out. We all have that moment where you light the candle and you get the glasses of wine out, and it's really nice. There's no distraction. There's no cell phones, TVs, nothing. But by 6, 8, 10, 12 hours the next day, it's getting old. If we can stop the outages right at the beginning by hardening the grid, toughening that grid, I believe we can make a big difference. And that's where we should and I will be putting a lot of our time and energy.
Mr. Harwood,
Yes.
You are, as you said, old school, and you believe in the monopoly utility heavily regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. Wouldn't it be in the best interest of the consumer to take the middleman out of that equation and have the utility be publicly owned, so we're not actually paying for the profit of a private owner? Is that not in the best interest of the consumer?
Didn't we just discuss this? It's a fair question. It is a fair question. Our energy world is upside down. There's a lot, as Rich Silkman said, by the time we get the electric vehicles and the heat pumps, we are going to electrify this society like it's never been before. And we have to ask all of those tough questions. The public was given the choice of turning CMP and Versant over to a public agency, a district set up by the government. I think the public, you can make the economic case that it's there. We send a lot of our tax money through CMP and Versant to Washington and Augusta. Those taxes are all loaded into your electricity costs. They would go away if we had public power, but it's a trade-off. There are things about public power that we're not ready to accept, and I think it was a 70-30 vote last November in which the voters spoke loud and clear, maybe with a little help and influence from CMP, but they spoke loud and clear that CMP is the son of a bitch, my son of a bitch, but I'll take care of it. I don't need you to take it over. And I think that's the message we heard. So I think we can get there with tough regulation. Look, the utility executives want to make their life easier. They want to make their job easier. They want to make their businesses run better. They will do what government tells them to do as long as we allow them to recover their costs and make a fair profit. It's on us in government to speak with clarity and tell them what we want. And that's been our problem. We send mixed signals to the utilities all the time, and their senior leadership says, if you guys could just be a little clearer, we'll go take care of it. We will do what you need. If you want the electricity to flow backwards across the wires, we'll hire the engineers and make that happen. But don't keep changing the rules on us and sending us inconsistent signals, because that's just impossible for us to manage.
Say, Bill. Bill Dunn over here.
Yep.
We could talk about what you were just talking about all day, but there's another way of doing net energy billing. It probably goes by a different name, and that's where the developer develops the project, and the individuals like me and others who want to be involved, we put up the money to build it. We get the energy then as a credit, an energy credit on our bill, and if the facility produces more than we need in the summer, say, we bank it and get it back in the winter. Does that have the same subsidy problems?
You're describing, let me start. When I described net energy billing for you, I oversimplified it. It is an incredibly complicated program. You've done a better job than I did of describing how net energy billing works. The problem is, what is the subsidy that's built in there? When CMP pays the customer to pay the developer, are they paying the 20 cents a kilowatt hour today that we're paying when we know it only costs the developer less than 10 cents? Because if that's still, we can run the dollars around through a bunch of different ways, but if at the end of the day, the Wall Street investor is getting the equivalent of 20 cent power when it's only costing them 10 cents, you and I as the ratepayers are going to make up that.
That's not the way the system I described works. I put up the money to build, I own shares of 2 solar farms elsewhere in the region, and they produce energy. I get a credit for the kilowatt hours produced. That goes against the kilowatt hours I consume at my home, and if I don't have enough kilowatt hours, I pay CMP for the difference, and if I have more than enough kilowatt hours, CMP banks it for me. They don't pay me for it. There's no money changing hands, and then I get the kilowatt hours back later.
We can discuss this offline, but I'll just say, I don't think you have zeroed in on those credits that show up on your bill. Those credits cost CMP ratepayers, and the credits in round numbers are worth about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's where the subsidy is. I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards.
Yeah, we'll chat after.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I don't have a microphone, but I got a big mic. Excuse me, we need to use the microphone. Certainly. My name's Tony McDonald. Yes. My name's Tony McDonald. Thank you for your remarks.
Tony, nice to meet you.
Can you turn the microphone on, please? Much better. My name's Tony McDonald. Thank you for your remarks. Back to the NEB financing question. Has the Public Utilities Commission expressed any interest in taking on that important role? And related to that question, is there any group or organized effort to move that from the legislature to the PUC? Sounds like a great idea, but who do I vote for, or what do I do to make that happen?
Yeah, I can't give you song and verse as to which legislators. There are some roll calls that have been done. The effort to reform the net energy billing has been spearheaded by our office, AARP, representing all the elderly in Maine, and in the Industrial Energy Consumer Group, representing the large industrials. So that has been the groups that have urged the legislature to do something, so far without success. Whether that continues and how that continues remains to be seen. Part of the problem is party politics. The Democrats were in charge in 2019. They had the Blaine House, they had the Senate, and the House. This net energy billing was passed on their watch. So the Republicans are having a field day, and you may have seen their press conference just last week saying, guess what? Your rates are going up on July 1st across the state, and if you're looking for who to blame, it's your Democrats down the hall. So it has taken on a partisan, which is unfortunate. I don't particularly love being there with the Republicans on one side of the room and the Democrats on the other. To me, should be a nonpartisan issue. But like so many things in Augusta, it is partisan. So what you've got is the Republicans arguing it's all the Democrats' fault, and unfortunately the Democrats are too often in the position of defending the program as best they can, and so we're at a stalemate.
So a follow-up to Tony's point is, let's say for sake of discussion, that the legislature should, for sake of discussion, the legislature ought not be the deciding vote on how energy is generated and delivered. And the regulating body should be the PUC. As a consumer, a citizen of this state with no professional experience in this field, it feels frightening to me to have this PUC that is not an elected body and often doesn't have daylight showing on their decisions. We read about it after they've decided and told us what they're going to decide, and it makes me very skeptical of the PUC.
It's a fair comment. We need to do a better job in government of transparency. Far too much of our decision-making is done behind closed doors. I think the PUC is trying, but it is very complicated, the issues before them. It doesn't lend itself to easy sound bites, easy explanation, but we are starting to. One of the programs that we have started to put in place is something called intervenor funding. And we have set aside some funds in which any group who would like to participate in the PUC process but feels that it needs an attorney or an expert witness or a consultant can apply for those funds, and our office will support that application so that you can have a seat at the table. We need to make sure that the hearing room at the PUC is not a closed club of a few lawyers from major Portland law firms representing big industry and big utilities. That's what the Office of Public Advocate does every day to try and stop that. We can't do it alone. We know that we can't bring the transparency to the process. We need you. And so when the Public Utilities Commission goes on the road, as it does frequently, and holds these public witness hearings, I think it's incumbent on the people, and sometimes it's a pain in the neck to get up from the dinner table at 7 o'clock and drive to wherever they are and stand up and say, I'm not okay with where we are. I'm not okay. The electric utility bills are too much. We spend a lot of time in our office on low-income ratepayers. We have one position who does nothing but answer the phone all day long, and it will make you weep to listen to some of the calls that come into our office. These are people who are trying to manage their household on a budget of $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 a year. And when CMP sends them a bill every month, and the total bill over the course of the year is around $2,000, it doesn't take a lot of mathematics to figure out that isn't going to work. If you're trying to live on a $30,000 household budget, you don't have $2,000 to send to CMP. Now, we have a program for low-income assistance. It's woefully underfunded. Our consultants tell us that we need a program funded of about $90 million. Through a lot of efforts of our office, we've gotten the funding up to $22 million. The difference between $22 million and $90 million is what we talk about as the affordability gap facing low-income ratepayers. And as Rich said, those rates are going to keep going up as we decarbonize the system. And my heart breaks for those low-income people because they are struggling and they can't live without electricity. And you know, more and more as we went through the heat wave last week, we've got a new problem coming, and that is, it used to be we only worried about CMP and Versant shutting off the power in winter. We know that our oil furnaces need electricity to run. We know that most of our stoves, we can't run our houses without electricity. And so we have this thing called the winter moratorium, where we've told CMP and Versant, no shutoffs during the winter. We'll figure it out in the spring how we get these people caught up on their bills, but no shutoffs. Now we're having the climate change, and we are finding out more and more that particularly elderly people have to have air conditioning to get through the heat waves. You can't, it's not healthy to live in a place where the temperature gets to be 90 or 95 degrees. So we are in the process of setting up new rules for CMP and Versant in which no shutting off during a heat wave. We don't want to see any low-income elderly person lose their air conditioning when the thermometer outside is 92 degrees. That's just part of this growing problem of managing the rising cost of electricity.
Hi, Bill. Joe Wishcamper, and I hope everybody can hear me. I'd like to shift away from the NEB question for a moment. I think you'll be relieved to hear that.
I'd be relieved, Joe. Joe and I have debated this NEB question over breakfast many times, and I have the greatest respect for Joe. And as I say, he is a smart guy who's done nothing wrong. I just don't like the program. But let's try a different subject.
Well, I'd say the same for you, Bill. The question is, with all of the improvements that are going to have to be made to the grid, is anyone in state government doing any long-term planning about how that is going to happen and how it's going to be financed, and whether we're going to be facing even higher gaps that will have to be subsidized in some way in the future?
We are doing more and more, but not enough. We got to do a better job of long-term planning. And part of the problem is when we restructured, it gets harder to plan because we're trying to gauge how many of you are going to buy an electric vehicle in the next 5 years. How many of you are going to install a heat pump in the next 5 years? These are challenging issues that we got to get right, and we have to understand what the load is going to be, what the demand for electricity. Then we can start looking at how best to serve that demand at the lowest possible cost. So we are doing more. The Governor's Energy Office under Dan Burgess's leadership is doing a really good job. They are about to come out with their Energy 2040 plan. So that will be a look at how we need to get to 2040 from here, what investments we need. One of the big questions is, what are we going to do about natural gas? A lot of people are on natural gas. We have natural gas in Yarmouth and Brunswick. We have about 50,000 customers who are natural gas. They are burning a fossil fuel to keep warm in the winter. They're burning natural gas to generate electricity. We have to figure out what is the right way to slowly shut down the natural gas, or at least to a shadow of its former self. And there's a whole bunch of questions there. Who's going to pay for the infrastructure that is stranded if that happens? But we can't meet our climate goals if the natural gas utilities continue to expand as they are. They are adding miles of pipe every year. They are adding dozens and hundreds of new customers every year, and more gas is coming through those pipes. How do we manage that piece? And that it all has to fit together, and it's not easy. Well, thank you very much for your time tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think that's one of our most informative and interesting, fascinating events that we've had. Bill, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Tom.
And Rich, thank you very much.